Hi, I'm Margaret Heffernan. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses, that's the practice part, and I write books and articles about how businesses work or don't. I'm really delighted to be kicking off the 3rd of our Dean series with an academic who's deeply embroiled in the strategy and development of today's universities, Dr. Rajani Naidoo. Rajani is a professor in higher education management here at the School of Management, but she's also held a range of faculty and management positions in the UK and in South Africa, including in an institution which aimed to contribute to the transformation of higher education in apartheid South Africa. She's also visiting professor holding the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation at Nelson Mandela University. Rajani's devoted her professional life to researching and monitoring the way in which academic institutions change in their needs, in their market positioning, in their sense of identity, the role they play in the community, and within a global world of ideas, invention, and discovery. We're here today to talk about higher education, not just because we're both in it. Increasingly, we're seeing a world that's absolutely dependent on academic institutions for the innovations which drive our economies and for the pioneering discoveries on which we've discovered during the pandemic, our very lives might depend. Whether we're simply grateful recipients of vaccines or parents with children hoping to go to universities, students hard at work within them, academics, administrators, caterers, cleaners employed by them, or governments that regulate them, there is no escaping higher education. It touches all of our lives. So how are they doing? What are the challenges or the opportunities that they face now? That's what we're going to be discussing today. Rajani, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this very nice invitation, Dr. Heffernan. And thanks also to our Dean, Steve Bremer, for this interesting series. It's really great to see so many of our alumni and PhD students and DBA students and our wider research network from all over the world. And I would just like to say a very quick special hello to Professor Richard Mordaunt, who actually had the vision to start the International Center for Higher Education Management and the DBA in the 1990s in a school of management, which was unheard of for its time. And that still gives us a lot of distinction these days.
Wonderful. Feels a bit like a reunion, doesn't it?
It does.
So I want to come at what is, I know, a very complex subject from 3 specific angles, really: the students, the academics, and the wider world that universities operate in and serve. So let's start with students. It may seem odd to many, but the role that students play in the life of a university has undergone a huge amount of change in our lifetime. You know, when I was an undergraduate, most university places, at least here in the UK, were free. Quite a small proportion of young people attended university, and we were grateful, privileged to join what was, in essence, quite a privileged group. And I just wondered, Rajani, if we think back to that time, how much has changed? What do you think are the kind of really critical changes that you've seen since, let's say, the 1980s, say?
Okay. Yes, I suppose you and I would have been undergraduates during the time when higher education was still quite an elite system. So there were a small number of universities worldwide. A smaller proportion of the age cohort that could go to university was going to university. And these were mostly students from pretty privileged backgrounds. And so in a way, I suppose higher education was very much contributing to reproducing the social relations in society. And that's changed quite dramatically now for a number of reasons. Some of the drivers have been the democratization of higher education, where higher education became seen to be important, not just for the privileged elite, but for everyone. With the advent of the knowledge economy, higher education suddenly had this position of being responsible to contribute knowledge that would contribute and enhance each country's position in the global economy. And then, interestingly enough, world organizations such as the World Bank, which previously had been persuading developing countries to not invest in higher education because the World Bank claimed there were very few social and economic returns. That position was totally overturned.
Wow.
And suddenly higher education was seen to be absolutely important in allowing developing countries to leapfrog over certain stages and to compete in the global economy. So we've seen a massification of higher education, with some countries having over 80% of their school-age cohort in higher education. Big success story with women, not in all subjects, but in general. Big success with students from certain ethnic groups, but not others. So we've seen a huge expansion, but at the same time, we've seen that universities are still not as welcoming as they could be. To students from working class backgrounds, from certain ethnic minorities, and so on. So there's still a long way to go in terms of higher education really becoming more equal and more accessible to everyone.
You talked about the democratization of higher education, but of course we've also seen the marketization of higher education. And I just wondered, what impact do you see with the fact that universities now compete for students, they now compete for all sorts of funding, they compete for kind of trophy buildings and trophy academics. What's been the impact of the marketization of education?
I think one of the most interesting transformations, at least in policy terms, has been the reconceptualization of the student as a disciple at the feet of the master. And I use the word master in a very kind of to mean something. And that conception has become transformed to one where the student is a consumer. And there were many reasons for that, partially in some countries where students began to pay fees for the first time, but also there was what I would call a manufactured distrust in universities. There was a sense that came from some governments that actually academics couldn't be trusted to teach, that they were basically hardly ever turning up to class, very slow in marking, and so on. And of course, there was a small bit of that in various countries, but that wasn't the whole picture. And so students would be transformed into consumers in order to increase the responsiveness of universities, in order to heighten quality, in order to bring in more diversity. And the picture for me in relation to that is quite mixed, because on the one hand, it has made universities, especially those that were really research intensive, focus much more on student learning and teaching. It's made the criteria for assessment much more clear, etc. But it's also brought in a mentality where students may feel that education is something that can be bought, that it's like going to a shop, picking up a product, and then you have it. That's your degree. So it kind of erodes the responsibility, the widening of horizons, and it creates very perverse incentives sometimes for academics, because if you are chasing student satisfaction, what could that mean? Does that mean that you teach better, that you bring in more risky teaching, that you challenge students more, or does it mean the reverse? So it has many different ramifications. But I think I would have to say that more recently I've taken on the role of head of the Race Equality Task Force at the University of Bath, and I've been engaging very closely with the student union here. And one of the things that has struck me is how unconsumerist our student union is, and that they're really fighting for, the decolonization of the curriculum. They're fighting for equity. They're looking at institutional bias, and they're doing some really, really important things that are for the betterment of society as a whole. And there's a group of students, for example, working in architecture who are talking about how do you decolonize the curriculum in architecture. So all of that is not very consumerist. And I find that really enlightening. And sometimes I think perhaps we, as teachers and managers, should trust students more and attribute less of a consumerist mentality to them, and actually also ensure that we don't treat them as consumers.
Yeah, because it takes two, right?
It takes two, yeah.
Yeah, how interesting. What do you think universities are selling to students? Is it about experiences? Is it about deep learning? Is it about employment? I mean, you hear so many different messages. And I think, some of that's changed over the last couple of decades. But what do you think from the students' perspective they're getting when they enroll in a program?
I think in the era of elite higher education, students were actually looking to universities to get a very wide learning experience. They wanted to learn for the sake of learning. I mean, there were, of course, also professional courses, for example, medicine and dentistry, which were more focused, but still there was a kind of understanding of intellectual areas that crossed over disciplines and so on. And now I think there is so much pressure on students in terms of employability. There are so few good jobs. And so students feel very, very pressured to kind of focus on their CVs, to focus on how to make themselves more employable. And that's not their fault. We often say that, students are much more narrow and much more instrumental. But I think if I was a young person in this scenario, I would probably be the same. So I think the challenge for us as educators is how to help them in terms of employment. And that often doesn't mean teaching to the test or teaching narrow skills. It means teaching much more innovative skills, learning how to learn, critical thinking, and so on. And at the same time, doing all the things that we did in the more liberal elite phase of education, but doing it in a way where this generation that is often time poor and resource poor can still actually take advantage of those high level advanced skills that higher education can bring to them.
Yeah. How far do you feel, what's happened in the last year has interrupted or accelerated those trends that you've been seeing?
I think what's happened in the last year has been, it's been both positive and negative in terms of the pandemic. And I think the one amazing thing that has made me really, really proud to be in this sector is the extent to which higher education institutions worldwide have responded to the crisis in so many positive ways, from, contributing to masks and ventilators, to, of course, the vaccine that was developed in such a short period of time, and so on. So I think there have been many, many positive aspects. And when I think about, all the reports that we get from the managers on our doctoral program in higher education management, who kind of represent more than 50 countries, the collaboration across borders that has happened is incredible. And the same in our own university. I think both in the school and in the university, I've just felt really proud of everything that we are doing. At the same time, as my colleague Andre Crete from Nelson Mandela University has written, is that sometimes crises are used by universities and governments to push against transformation. Mm. And fortunately, that hasn't happened in our university or our school, but I've seen it happening across the sector, where suddenly critical management studies scholars are kind of quietly moved out. The liberal arts has been challenged, and so on. And I think that's extremely worrying. So I think it's but even with the development of the vaccine, for example, universities have been both absolutely fantastic, but at the same time, the way in which they have worked with pharmaceutical companies has not always contributed to the global good. So the arrangements that universities have made with Big Pharma have actually left out developing countries that can't afford the vaccine. So I think overall, it's taught us how important it is to collaborate, what some of the negative implications of competition are. But it's also taught us about how to exist virtually, and that's been quite interesting. How do you reach people virtually? And I think that's transformed how we teach, how we manage, how we relate to each other, and so on.
But of course, it's also made students quite angry about the amount that they're paying. Do you think that's kind of started to amplify this notion of the student as consumer?
I think so. I think it very much depends on the relationship between the university and the students. So we've done some preliminary research on that, and it's really, really different across universities. And it doesn't seem to have followed, status of the university or how rich the university is or anything. It's been very much linked to the leadership. Where in some cases the police have been called onto campus, and universities have been charging students huge amounts in rent. In other campuses, it's been rent-free. So I think it will strengthen the consumerist mentality of students, where they feel they've paid a lot, but they haven't had face-to-face teaching. But I'm not sure exactly how that will play out. That will very much depend on the response of governments and universities.
Sure. Of course, as you mentioned, higher education is now a big global and highly competitive industry. All universities, to some extent, are competing globally for students. They're competing for the big names that attract students and the big facilities that might attract big names. And you've written, I know, about the competition fetish, as you put it, that seems to dominate academic life now. How far do you think that competition is foreclosing other kinds of educational reform?
Yes, I think I call it the competition fetish because it's almost become a magical belief that competition will solve all the problems of modern higher education. You just throw competition at that, and and the problem will be solved. And I think it's very problematic because we're not looking at how different types of competition in higher education interact. So we have market competition, we have government-sponsored competition, the excellence contests, we have ranking, and these all interact together with traditional scientific competition.
Right.
And one of the issues is that competition becomes very naturalized. So we immediately think that competition is natural. There's no other way to go. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we think that competition legitimates inequality. Everyone has an equal chance to enter the competition.
Right.
If they don't succeed, it's their fault.
Yeah.
And it forecloses areas like planning. You know, planning now seems so old-fashioned, or collaboration or strategy, etc. And I think that's really problematic. I mean, imagine if we, in response to the coronavirus, if we said that let's just respond to the coronavirus through market competition, we would be in an absolutely terrible state in the world. So I suppose I'm not saying that competition in all areas of higher education is negative, but we need to look at where competition works and what some of the negative consequences are, and put in other ways of planning and managing and working in higher education.
Yeah. And who would you say is driving these strategies? Is it coming from, the presidents and vice chancellors of universities? Is it coming from government? Is it coming from the media? I mean, I'm very, very struck by the degree to which rankings seem to have kind of stolen strategic minds, that the goal is not so much to be a great university as to have a high position in the rankings. Mm-hmm. Who is driving this primarily, would you say?
Yes, I think it's so interesting that some, a mechanism that was started to sell newspapers,
which it does.
becomes so powerful, and really, I think, enters the psyche of everyone in universities. So I think it's been started by the media, and there's so many different types of rankings now that universities can more or less choose the ranking in which the university features best. But it's also, of course, university presidents and vice chancellors, the senior leadership. It's students. Students look at rankings because they feel that will impact on their employability. So Ian Jameson and Avi Shankar and I looked at rankings in relation to students as consumers. But also it's academics. All of us get very much seduced by the fear of shame and the desire for fame. We all want to be famous. We all want to look good. And I think it's something that's probably going to be very hard to do away with. I think if I were a university that had absolutely no hope of doing well in the rankings, and if I was leading that university, I would opt out, but kind of create a very big marketing message about why I've opted out, because there's so much resources, both financial and administrative, that are kind of put into rankings, that there is a real danger that universities want to look good rather than be good, rather than investing in their mission. They are investing in rankings. And I think even, universities in low-income countries are as complicit. So Jack Lee and I wrote about this, about how leaders in developing countries also engage in the rankings that really are not fit for purpose for certain contexts. But because the rankings kind of entrench the characteristics of elite universities, it's very, very powerful.
Right.
So we're all implicated.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that always strikes me is the degree to which certainly some of the universities I've worked with essentially kind of backward engineer their strategy to ensure that they do well in the rankings, which is a kind of delegation of leadership to an algorithm rather than to what one might expect to be a fairly principled exploration of what the university stands for. Do you see many universities really with the clout or the courage to stand outside that?
No, I think it would have to be led by the most powerful universities in the world, and the rankings service the most powerful universities so well that they won't do it.
Yeah.
So I think in a way it should be maybe the wannabe universities and the universities that are really taking in, the most disadvantaged students, working across so many different barriers, that really need to opt out and say, we won't play this game anymore.
You talked about collaboration, and particularly that collaboration between academics. I mean, clearly during the pandemic, we've seen a great deal of that. So, I'm also thinking of the Human Genome Project, which involved, universities all over the world. And I just wondered, what are the forces that keep this kind of collaboration alive? When you're in this very competitive system, people competing for funds, for funding of research, for academics, and so on. What is it that keeps the spirit of collaboration alive in global higher education?
I think there's an intrinsic scientific desire to discover. And, often when you look at some of the kind of great innovations that have made a big difference in health, originally the researchers were not looking to discover a cure for X or a cure for Y. They were engaged in very basic scientific blue skies research, in a way, moonshot research, where they were really interested in discovering something, in how something worked, and so on. And I think that intrinsic desire is what keeps collaboration going. And you would need to look then for anybody. It wouldn't matter what country the person was in, or what discipline the person was in, or what university. You would be looking for somebody who would help you work together and collaborate in kind of getting to that discovery that you really want to. And despite the many barriers, we've got Brexit now, and financial barriers, and the kind of huge focus on short-term impact, on economic gain.
Right.
Academic researchers have still continued against so many odds, because they really have this intrinsic motivation and commitment to do that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, when everybody's been jumping around talking about, the Oxford vaccine, I've been thinking about, first of all, the degree to which that vaccine project was run with the collaboration of many scientists in many universities.
Right.
And it's also building on the work of immunologists over the last 50 years.
Exactly.
So although we have this kind of attraction to the notion of a star, some star scientist who's cracked the vaccine, actually it's building on the work of hundreds and hundreds of people, and much of the very basic research that you talk about. It's impossible without that incredible legacy.
Yeah.
And I just, it bothers me when we say, oh, it's the Oxford vaccine. Well, what about the other universities involved? Or it's this scientist or that scientist. Well, what about, the whole network of knowledge on which this kind of work is based? And I just wondered, does that become quite demotivating, this notion that actually the whole ecosystem, which is the wealth of higher education, has become kind of invisible as we've started playing to kind of Hollywood box office?
Yes, I think so. I think it must be very demotivating, but there's an even bigger danger because, as we were talking about, when you look at scientific breakthroughs, there was so much time. There are so many individuals, so many research institutes were involved in that. And it's, this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants is really, really accurate. And for me, the big danger is the Hollywood stars of higher education. But also the danger is that the trend in terms of funding and regulation now seems to be to concentrate resources in so-called, world-class universities. So you actually, when you concentrate resources in that way, according to who the stars are at this particular moment, you actually take resources away from other parts of the ecosystem.
Right.
And that's very, very dangerous for our future and for future scientific endeavors.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I've written a lot about how, that would work fine if you could predict who's going to discover what when.
Right.
The nature of discoveries, right? That you can't predict that at all.
Right.
And lots of the great breakthroughs have come from people that didn't look promising, working in places that didn't look promising. Mm-hmm. And this notion that somehow somebody, or God forbid, another algorithm can pick it, is just not borne out by the history of science. And so this notion that rankings or a breakthrough or whatever are going to show where the wealth of talent is strikes me as, demotivating, but also just actually flawed.
Yep, absolutely. It's absurd. It just makes no logical sense, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah. I'm very struck, I was reading just in newspapers this weekend a lot about, wow, universities now have to completely rethink their role and their existence in the light of, the move to digital. Do we need campuses? Do we need face-to-face? All this sort of thing. I'm also intrinsically skeptical about the kind of digital hype machine, I have to say. Do you think that what we've learned about remote teaching in the last year has fundamentally changed anything in our understanding of the value of higher education or how it works?
I think it's made us understand the value of relationships and connectivity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of high quality teaching. But having said that, I think I've been really impressed, for example, our little higher education group, the way we moved online. And none of us were very, techie in the first place. But it worked really well. And the reasons that it worked was because we managed to, establish connectivity and social relations between new groups of students before we started on the curriculum. So I think, when people say you can't replicate more or less anything, or you can't replicate relationships in an online environment, I think you can. Mm-hmm. And I think it is possible. But of course, I would favor a more balanced and blended approach, in a way, doing some things digitally, especially if you're working across borders, makes a lot of sense in terms of saving the planet and so on, and time. People don't have to get on a plane and travel. So, it's also more flexible. Students who have caring responsibilities can work from home. So it's taught me some of the possibilities of going digital, but at the same time, there's still a big disadvantage and a divide. When you look, for example, I was talking to one of my colleagues in South Africa, where the students have basically, a lot of the students have said, but we don't want to go back home. We want to stay on the university campus because we have access to Wi-Fi. We live in a less crowded condition. So the going digital also reinforces some of the kind of major inequalities that we have in higher education as well.
Interesting. We have a wonderful question here. Most universities over the past years have started to offer a lot more practice-based learning. So, placements, internships, things like that. of course, that's also been made much harder by the pandemic. Lots of firms have canceled all those sorts of things. But do you think that general trend towards practice-based learning will continue post-pandemic?
It depends how the pandemic pans out, I suppose. But I think there's some quite interesting developments in doing placements in a virtual way. It's not the same. You don't, imbibe the institutional culture and so on, but it still works. So I think we will continue to have placements, but they will look probably quite different. If we're doing it in a way that's still socially distanced, or we're doing it virtually, and so on. I think placements have been really, really important and useful for many groups of students. So it would be a pity to exclude placements because of the pandemic conditions. So I'm very hopeful that we will continue.
No, I'm very interested, that, I mean, I guess I regard it as a very positive trend that people get a real experience of work before they leave university, because I'm always struck, by the number of people who heretofore have left university with no experience of work at all, and suddenly they have to make this huge life decision. Where am I going to work? What am I going to do? Who am I going to be? On the basis of virtually no experience at all. So that strikes me as quite useful. On the other hand, I wonder how much the kind of focus on practice-based learning has taken away from the knowledge, from the sense of your university years as a quest for knowledge, as learning to learn, as learning to learn for its own sake. Has this all become rather tactical?
I think it has had to become practical and tactical for certain groups of students, because they need it. When you go on a placement, it puts you in a very good position to enter the job market. So there were many reasons for why placements are useful, as well as just learning all sorts of very important skills on the job. But I think it can be both. And I think the problem is we either go, especially in Britain, we go either very, very academic, where we are widening our horizons and kind of really focusing on intellectual development, or we go very practical. And I think you can do both in a much more interesting way. And we have quite a narrow curriculum in general, and I think that's really, so students don't really learn about global citizenship, or you would think that students in engineering and science would also learn about philosophy or literature or other kind of mind expanding subject matters, and the same with students in arts and social sciences. And it would be very, very good to have more of a mixed curriculum. And people always say, but then you don't get enough depth. And I think you can get the depth, and then you can kind of touch on other aspects of the curriculum. Or for example, now with the whole Black Lives Matter, it's amazing that nobody learns about slavery. In Britain. It's part of our history, and it's not to go back and blame, but it's to understand where we come from and to understand where we're going and how to make things better. So I think the curriculum as a whole, it would be, this period gives us a very good opportunity to look at what do we want young people to learn.
Yeah. But it's quite interesting though, isn't it? Because you also, certainly here in the UK, you get a huge narrowing of educational exposure when people choose their A levels, and then a really, bigger narrowing of educational exposure when they choose their degree subject. And a huge effort or emphasis, but certainly by the government, against liberal arts and in favor of, STEM subjects,
Mm.
And all this seems to be kind of pushing to a narrower focus. Do you see that same trend in other countries, and how far does it worry you?
So I've looked at, for example, universities in Colombia, in Latin America, and you don't see that same trend. The education is much broader. There's a mix of liberal arts and science subjects. A really good example is the Cuban medical school education, where you would expect that, given the fact that Cuba is a socialist country, you'd expect perhaps that to be more ideological. And actually, I went on a study visit there, and it was really interesting. So there was students studied medicine, but they also studied philosophy and dance and sociology and so on. And for me, that seemed like a very, very interesting model. So I think there is a narrowing, much more so in countries like Britain. And the countries that are a little bit below the radar, because they're not, it's not Britain, Germany, or England, that are doing really interesting things with the curriculum in terms of broadening it, but keeping the quality and the depth. They're not visible to our view. And one of the things I'd really like to do is to kind of highlight that, so that we can all learn from those countries.
Yeah. We've had a good question here from Jonathan Dempsey, who's talked about how the current UK government is really pushing against having a majority of people going to university, and instead pushing apprenticeships and other kinds of adult education, as it were. And he also talks about the huge focus on education as not just a source of employment, but measured by the kind of salary that it leads to. How far do you think this militates against students feeling they really have a choice, and how far is it kind of trying to force people into particular disciplines, do you think?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I have quite a few comments on that. The first is that I think we do have an overemphasis on certain types of higher education for everyone. So it's, now it appears that if you want to become a hairdresser, you need a degree. And I think we should follow much more a system like the German system, where you have a really good mixture of academic and vocational education. But the important thing, which is not true in the British context, is both the academic and the vocational education has very high status with society as a whole and with employers. So I think we need to look at a different system of higher education that's also funded and regulated in a different way, because at the moment, the funding system really privileges the most elite research-intensive universities that take on the students that are the most socially advantaged, whereas the universities that really take on the students from very disadvantaged communities, the funding system really disadvantages them. So you're kind of getting the whole system is replicating advantage and disadvantage. And institutions are not funded properly to meet their missions. So I think we need to look much more at a higher education system that is valued for its diversity, for institutional differentiation and diversity, where institutions can have very, very different missions and can attract students that want to do different things with their lives.
Yeah. I mean, what you say suggests that to some degree, the funding of universities, certainly in the UK, could be seen as driving social divisiveness.
Yes, I think I would say that. The funding system, but also the institutional culture. of
Right.
universities. So with the funding system, if you look at it, it's very, very clear that research intensive, rich universities gain more and more funding. That the excellence contests of the government actually privilege those universities. If we had another form of competition where, which universities take on the most disadvantaged students, and then you change the funding in that way, you'd get a very, very different picture. And I'm not saying that, that the funding should be removed from our elite world-class universities and totally transferred to other universities, but I'm just saying that there needs to be more balance.
Mm-hmm.
And also, instead of purely chasing privilege and world-class status, that these universities should have a responsibility for building capacity in the system as a whole.
Right.
And then I think institutional cultures, where I just give my example. I went to university in apartheid South Africa. So I had to get special permission to go to a whites only university. And I entered the university, and I was reading law and English, entered the university and sat in, one of the row of seats, and all the students moved away from that row immediately. So that was the first shock. And it was also, there were groups of very racist students beating up young Black men and women students on campus. So it was a really very difficult phase. And I studied literature, and I was very, very pleased to be introduced to, Shakespeare and William Blake and so on. And especially, I think William Blake is still one of my favorite authors. But there was no literature from my country and not from the continent. And when I asked about that, I was told that that's not literature. And fortunately for me, there was a professor called David Morn Brown who just said, I will develop a course on African literature that will be completely optional. And he did that. And I just remember, firstly, the fact that it was such a critical course and looked at literature in terms of its socio-political context. So I learned so much. But I also immediately started feeling at home. And, so these small transformations in culture in universities make a huge, huge difference. And I think when I look at universities today, the institutional culture of universities is absolutely not welcoming to working class students, to students from, of color, same with women, disability, sexuality. We have some really, really difficult environments and a lot of work to do there.
Yeah. And how do you feel about the UK government's desire to intervene in this? To start to try to intervene in terms of, regulating freedom of speech and definition.
I'm very worried about that. The fact that student unions are in danger of losing their charitable status, and they will be coming under regulation. I think there's a proposal that they'll be coming under our Office for Students. I'm really, really worried about that. I think that, part of the role of universities is to be relatively independent from political and economic forces. And I think, you want universities to be able to have the freedom to call truth to power. It's absolutely essential for democracies. And I find it really surprising, and I'm very dismayed by the attempts by governments in democracies to actually curtail freedom of speech in universities.
Yeah. I want to change tack quite a lot right now and talk about what I often think of is the sort of hidden infrastructure of universities, which are a vast cadre of professional administrators and managers. Mm-hmm. And I would have to say, having recently joined the University of Bath, I'm deeply grateful to these individuals who have helped me kind of thread my way and figure out how on earth to, get things done and so on. But I'm also very struck that there is, as there is in quite a lot of institutions, there's a sort of two-tier structure where the academics are the kind of jewels in the crown, and the administrators are often invisible and frequently, I think, uncelebrated, under-rewarded. And the question that we have here from Alison Crook is, what do universities need to attract the best people who do this work? What skills should they have? And, what can or should universities do? I think both to cherish and value this necessary, absolutely vital ecosystem, and to really give it some status.
Hmm. So I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I absolutely agree with you about, fantastic administrators are just worth their weight in gold. I mean, we have Jacqueline Stockley, who I think we could not survive without her. And I think the status issue is changing. I think, as we have, Jürgen Enders and I have done some work on this, where as the external conditions change, and as we have more audit forces, we have more marketing, we have more regulation, administrators become the intermediaries of audit and market forces. So they can either reinforce these forces or they can protect the academic heartland. So I think because of that, their status is being enhanced. But at the same time, as administrators say that they are second status, academics feel that they are also becoming second status. So there's something going on in terms of the power relationship. And I think that old view where, fantastic administrators were kind of relegated to be support mechanisms and just plain support structures with no independence and no valuing and no reward was a really disastrous situation. And I'm very glad we've moved away from that. But I think we still have a long way to go in terms of how we recognize and value administrators. So, for example, academics have a lot of autonomy and discretion over where they work and how they work. And in a way that just makes us work all the time, everywhere, weekends and evenings. So it's not such a healthy thing. But administrators don't seem to have that. And so I think, that could be one really small and easy way in which to balance the situation.
Yeah.
And to reward administrators more. But I think the most important thing is when you work together in a team, when academics and administrators work together in a team for a common purpose. And the problems with the modern university is that administrators are being positioned in between senior leadership and academics.
Right.
So they're the ones that sort of, bring in the bad news or ensure that academics comply and so on. And that's the wrong relationship, whereas academics feel that they have to comply, they have to answer to, rather than doing the work. And I think it's really important that we get that relationship right, that it becomes more equal, but that people also work together. I've learned a huge amount from the managers on our doctoral program, just massively. So much of my research has been influenced by their insights and their own research as well. So I think I'm hopeful that conditions will become better.
Yeah. We're almost running out of time, and I'm going to try to squeeze in two more questions. The first one is, looking forward, do you think higher education will remain higher, or just part of kind of post-18 education, or will it become a lifelong learning process?
I would hope that it would become a lifelong learning process, that, you know, one of the issues for higher education, I think, is that somehow we have to try to recapture people, that young people especially, that are excluded and alienated. And we may not be able to do that with degrees or diplomas, but there might be other ways in which we can reach out and talk to those young people in terms of lifelong learning, because otherwise they are going to move all the way into right-wing fundamentalism. And that's very, very worrying for me. So I hope we can reach out to more people in terms of lifelong learning, also older people, etc. But I think my fear is that instead of becoming a more coherent higher education system, that we will stratify much more. We will have these very elite, very high status, research intensive universities, and then a whole mass of institutions that are less well resourced, have less status, and so we'll be getting increasing stratification. I hope not, but that's my fear, and that's the way in which policy seems to be going in contemporary times.
My last question, which you've answered a little bit, but is what role ultimately do you think universities should and can play in our lives now and in the future? What should they be providing to society as a whole?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, because I'm writing something for UNESCO for the Futures of University project, and I guess I would say that I think one of the big issues that universities should contribute to is to somehow heal the fractures in our society. So we have, you know, escalating poverty, we have escalating violence, we have inequality, and the whole future of our planet is endangered. And so I think universities, through the research, through their teaching, and through their social engagement, should tackle these sorts of issues. And we should look at very carefully at how our research and our teaching impacts on these factors. But I think it's really important that to understand that all universities can't do everything.
Right.
And so we really need to have a system that works very well, where different universities tackle different aspects of these issues and are valued and rewarded for it. And I think the most important thing that universities need to reclaim is the freedom to call truth to power. Because that's something that we are losing. And the only way in which we can do that is to stand together collectively and fight against incursions to academic freedom.
Right, absolutely. We could keep talking forever. I feel pretty confident, but time is against us. Rajani, thank you so much for a really enlightening insight into where universities stand today. There's clearly much more we could say on the subject, and I hope we can explore some of this in some of our future seminars, which I'll be hosting between now and the summer. I'm going to be talking next to an expert in cybersecurity here at the university. Then we're doing a webinar on leadership, and another on the problem that never seems to go away, diversity. I hope you can all join me for some of those. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us. And many thanks to you, Rajani, for sharing your work and your ambition with us here today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that.
Great. Thank you and goodbye.